As always, pull up a chair and make yourself at home. They're waiting. My husband Dawson and I love adventure. Sometimes we'll plan a trip for months before the day of travel, and on more rare occasions, he and I will read about something and decide on a whim to go on an excursion to one of these places of interest. A few years back, Dawson and I were trying to decide if we'd like to go somewhere for our birthdays, since we both have birthdays in October. We love to celebrate with friends and family, but oftentimes, he and I like to celebrate just the two of us. It had been a few years since we had gone camping, and I don't ever recall a time he and I went camping alone together, because we always had friends or our kids with us. Dawson and I had been talking and thought about how beautiful the trees would be up in northern Arizona this time of year. We decided to camp in the open forest, somewhere near Mormon Lake. We had both agreed that we wanted to find a secluded location, away from campgrounds. We packed all the necessary provisions: food, tent, water, wine, and our two large pit bulls, Loki and Polly. We then set off to make the 2-hour drive north to fall leaves, cooler temperatures, and the smell of wood smoke. When we finally made it, we thought we would just drive around until we found our ideal spot. I know this probably wasn't the best idea, especially since we only told people we were heading up north while not revealing a specific location. At about 3:30 in the afternoon, we settled on a spot far off a dirt road that led a little deeper into the forest. We pulled into a little clearing within the trees and began unloading our camping gear. I went with Loki and Polly to collect stones for a makeshift fire pit and to collect plenty of firewood for the night. Dawson began setting up the tent. A while later, we put on a good mystery to listen to while we prepared our burgers for dinner. We turned our back to continue our camp setup when Loki decided he would swiftly maneuver toward the grill and steal one of the cooked burgers. I still remember Dawson's reaction. That's it. He's on the rope until we're done with dinner. We enjoyed our dinner and wine in peace, without the threat of Loki or Polly snagging more of our food. I rinsed the dinner pan and dishes as best as I could, placed them in a garbage bag, and hung them in a tree a few yards away from our camp. I returned to enjoy the blazing fire and the company of Dawson and our dogs. As the sun was starting to sink, we began hearing gunshots in the distance. Dawson and I know that this is common to hear in the woods, but it bothered us for a few reasons. One reason was that the gunshots didn't seem far from our campsite. We know that sound carries in the mountains, but these shooters were still uncomfortably close. Another reason was that nobody knew our location, and we had no cell service at our campsite. We had just committed Camping 101, top 2 things not to do. Even though we felt uncomfortable with the distance of the shooters from our camp, we wanted to try to stay to continue celebrating together. We settled into our camp chairs and watched the fire as night fell. At first we felt fine, but we became disquieted when we heard what we thought was a pack of coyotes. But as we continued to listen, they sounded different. The noises of whatever this pack was were not coyote. I don't have a sound I could use to even describe these animals. Their sounds were like coyotes, but almost sounded as if they were having conversations with each other. It was at this time that our larger pit bull, Loki, began circling the camp. He was practically running around it, continuously, only to stop and growl in the direction of forest that contained a thicker section of trees. Polly, our other pit bull, walked to the opposite side of the camp, turned her back to my chair, faced a different portion of the forest, and also growled. This made me really uncomfortable, as the dogs were unsettled about whatever was in the thick of the trees. Their behavior even made me reach for my firearm and hold it on my lap. My uneasiness made me want a larger fire, so I began throwing on more wood. As the blaze began to increase, my nerves settled a bit. I told Dawson that the noises made by the pack of animals and the behavior of the dogs was making me very nervous. He told me that we should just try to relax for a while, see if the dogs might settle down. I told him that was fine, but if he wanted to still stay the night, I wasn't planning on sleeping. At this point, I was going to stay up with the firearm until sunrise. We just sat by the fire, while Loki and Polly continued to alert to whatever was in that forest. That's when I heard it. It sounded like an unnatural scream. Coming from the direction of the forest Polly was looking into. As I turned into that direction with a start, Polly abruptly got up and leapt into the open hatch of the back of the truck. Loki took his patrol up a notch, stopping by the vehicle and now growling at 2 locations within the forest. He continued to growl toward the heavily treed section, but now he would stop at the area where we heard the scream. I had pretty much made up my mind that I wanted to leave. I felt the later it got, the more frightening it would be to tear down our campsite. I was even contemplating leaving it all, grabbing the dogs, and accelerating out of there as quickly as possible. But even then, Dawson wasn't sure he wanted to leave. He was clearly unnerved, but I think he just didn't want to frighten me. Then all of a sudden, Dawson jumped up and looked out toward the dirt road we came in on, and stared for a long while. I kept asking him what was going on, yet he wouldn't answer. Then finally, he turned around and tells me, "We need to pack up everything, now." We began frantically breaking down the tent, putting everything haphazardly in the back of our truck. We took a couple of gallons of water that we had brought for the trip and doused the fire. I don't know what on earth made me run back to grab my pans hanging in the trees, but thankfully, Dawson pulled up as close as he could in the truck. I bolted from the passenger door, grabbed the bag, and jumped right back in the truck. As we began driving, I told him that even if we got a flat tire, we weren't stopping until we could at least reach cell service. At that point, I asked him what made him change his mind about staying the night. And that's when he said that he had noticed headlights in the distance. A car was driving very slowly down the dirt road we came in on. But as the car began moving closer toward our campsite, the car's headlights had clearly been deliberately turned off in order to avoid detection. It was at that point he knew we needed to leave. We drove for about 20 miles, where we finally made it to the highway that would take us home. I still don't know if we had a close call that night, but whatever was out there, the dogs knew it wasn't something friendly. I don't know if I'll decide to camp again in the near future, but if I do again one day, I'll stick to more populated campgrounds. The call of the wild has always had its hold on me. It's not just about experiencing it through scenic drives, hikes, or camping trips. For me, it's about capturing its untamed beauty through the lens of my camera. I've been into photography now since I was a kid, and as I grew up, that passion only grew stronger. A couple of years back, I finally upgraded to professional gear, honing my skills and making the wildlife and nature I capture even more captivating. Usually, I make a day trip out of it. I scout good areas and then find where I'd like to go. But sometimes my projects call for a camping expedition, only I turn it into one merely because I love the outdoors. sometimes dragging along a friend or venturing out solo. It all just depends on what I'm up to. However, there's one trip that made me swear off camping alone, no matter where it might be. It was late fall in 2021 when the chance for a solo camping trip deep in the heart of the Mark Twain wilderness came up. Of course, I jumped on it, hoping to capture the final stages of the breathtaking fall colors. The vibrant leaves had turned into rusty oranges and deep mahoganies, truly a sight to behold before they all fell. Plus, it was prime time to snap some wildlife amid these stunning colors. As usual, I scouted for the perfect spot to set up camp, wanting my own slice of nature. The days leading up to my trip soon melted away, and before I knew it, I was wandering the forest not too far from my campsite. Thankfully, the place was devoid of other campers, just how I wanted, giving me the solitude I craved. With my camera as my constant companion, I explored, hoping to catch elusive wildlife and breathtaking views. The nights, of course, carried a different vibe, an eerie stillness that surrounded my tent. But that's bound to come with any solo adventure. Still, I found a comfort cocooned in my sleeping bag, and the forest ambience soon lulled me into a steady sleep. It was the morning after that changed everything. Even now, just writing about it gives me a great sense of unease. As dawn broke, I sat outside my tent, eager to review the previous day's shots. Mug of coffee in hand, I grabbed my camera to start sifting through the images. But then it happened. A shock that made all of my blood run cold. Not a picture taken by me, but of me. Fast asleep inside my tent. My head spun, and I felt as though I was trapped in a nightmare. Someone had wandered into my camp, into my tent, and then took my camera and snapped a picture of me while I was asleep. What would even possess someone to do such a thing? I'm not a careless guy, but I never imagined something like this happening. But I guess that's how it usually goes. With everything else in my camp surprisingly untouched, I didn't hesitate to pack up. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting some crazed stranger to be peering at me from behind a tree, wide-eyed and grinning. The rush of adrenaline in my veins as I trembled to pack up will forever be stained in my memory. I was lucky to get out when I did, and I couldn't imagine what could have happened had I stayed. As far as my photography goes, nothing's changed there, but I can tell you, it probably won't be too long until I forget how to pitch a tent. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway in the great outdoors. My friend Aaron and I had chosen a remote spot, something to escape the craziness of everyday life. The air was crisp that night, the campfire providing such a sense of calm and relief. The only sounds out there were the occasional rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. He and I exchanged stories, laughter blending with the delicate wind, but that tranquility would soon be shattered by an unexpected visitor. Out of the darkness appeared a man, disheveled and disoriented. His clothes were dirty, and he seemed exhausted, something usual after a long day on the trail. But as he drew closer to camp, Aaron and I gave each other a look. The man called out, briefly explaining that he had lost his way on the main trail and had noticed the light of our flame. It was in our nature to be helpful and friendly, so we invited him to join us by the fire to catch his breath, offering him some food and water. He eagerly accepted, sitting across from us with a faint smile. but we couldn't help but notice his odd look and behavior. And for someone who sounds like they were coming back from a long hike, this man didn't have any gear. He wore an old hoodie, faded denim jeans, and some athletic shoes that wouldn't be quite adequate enough for the surrounding terrain. We noticed he kept trying to subtly glance over his shoulder into the dark forest, and he did this a lot. Aaron and I attempted to make some small talk with him, but his answers seemed short and incomplete. I began feeding off his energy, and I no longer felt at ease. As a bit more time ticked on, his presence in our camp grew increasingly unsettling. He would occasionally mutter under his breath, hinting at a troubled past. He randomly looked up with a partial smile as if trying to engage in conversation, and he said to us, "I don't become crazy anymore." His eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and fear. It was as if he may carry a heavy burden, something more than just being lost in the woods. Aaron shot me a worried look, and we silently agreed that something here was not right. We suspected intoxication. Something definitely seemed to be clouding this stranger's senses. But then, in a moment that froze the very air around us, he whispered, "They're here." Before we could even react, he staggered to his feet and stumbled back into the impenetrable darkness, leaving us stunned and apprehensive. Fear gripped us like a vice. The crackling fire offered little comfort as our minds raced with ominous possibilities. Who was there? And was he running from something? At that, we contemplated abandoning camp in haste, and we did. The notion of staying amid such uncertainty seemed absurd. To this day, the memory of that encounter lingers, and there's not a trip I take now where it doesn't cross my mind at least once.